Okay, first I'd like to thank you all for having me here today. I come at it from a somewhat unique perspective, not only as a researcher and an academician, but also as somebody who's lived in communities that have been touched by this tragedy. I don't want to steal the thunder of later speakers, so I will leave that particular community out that I am linked to. But I was fortunate enough to go to the University of Central Florida, which, if you're familiar with it, is in Orlando, which before Las Vegas was the home of, for 16 months, the deadliest mass shooting in the United States of America. And so it's really something that, from a personal perspective and also from a research perspective, is something that I really focus on. I've had the opportunity to meet with a number of survivors throughout the years, and two of those whom I've met are Tom and Karen Teeves, who founded the No Notoriety campaign after their son Alex was among those who were killed in the Aurora, Colorado movie theater. So I'll speak to you a little bit today about the campaign and what that calls for and how it's supported by the research. So just to kind of put this into context, I'm sure at some point we've all seen something like one of these. What we also tend to not see, because they don't like to turn the cameras on themselves, is this. And it becomes a feeding frenzy, if you will, where there's 30 microphones shoved in front of a police officer's mouth. One of the things that I found to be the most interesting with Friday's shooting in Santa Fe, Texas, is that people were speculating after the first public information officer or the sheriff came out and gave a very brief press conference, here's what we know, and all of a sudden social media went rampant. He's wearing Nazi regalia, he's doing this, he's doing that, he wasn't loved enough. And the fact of the matter remains is that when this is going on, no one understands, it seems, what's really going on in one of these scenes, which is that law enforcement has an extremely arduous task of making sure that that scene is secured, making sure that the medical examiner can get in, because at some point during that day, families are going to have to be notified that their loved ones are not coming home. And so ultimately, the issue becomes that our society has created this demand for information, this demand for a need to know, and that seems to be weighing out over the importance of understanding the facts about these events. So that's kind of what I'd like to start with today. So when we look at the media coverage of these events, we see an exorbitant amount of attention. Wall-to-wall coverage. We saw this really started with Columbine, and that's because when Columbine happened back in 1999, the 24-hour news cycle was very young, the way that we know it today. CNN was the first to break live coverage from the scene. It went 6 hours before they sort of moved on and started running canned packages, but it was really the first time that we saw this live, uninterrupted coverage. And I don't know about you guys, but when I think about the media coverage today, I'm like, wow, 6 hours would be an amazing reprieve, because you get it for about 7 days and you're just like, okay, how much more of this can I really stomach as a human being? And before I click, I want to point something out because this is really the undertone of everything that I stand for as a researcher. The loss of one life to one of these events is absolutely one too many. So nothing that I say will ever be in a context of diminishing the loss of life. I know people who have been impacted by these events. I've met people who have lost their children, lost their spouses, so I'm not diminishing their life. But this is the relation of how much media attention we get to the actual occurrence of mass shootings in this country. When we think about our larger crime picture here in the United States, homicide more broadly represents 0.1% of offenses known to law enforcement. Things like sexual assault, forcible rape, regular assault is considerably more common, but that's not what we hear about when we turn on the news cycle. We hear about these very egregious crimes. When we're talking about mass shootings, these are a fraction of that 0.1%. They are extremely statistically rare events, but they do capture our attention because of the extreme amount of loss of life. One thing that's often missing from the news coverage when it breaks, and even well after it breaks, is the idea of context. That is not present. This is actually what my dissertation research focused on. I looked at media representations of mass shootings in a post-Columbine era. And one of the things that I found really interesting in my work was, one of the things I looked for was how many times is statistics given? How many times are we offered context? And in over 2,000 statistical references in 90 mass shootings, only 3 times were we told anything related to the national crime picture. And even then, it was very, very general and distorted. Part of the reason why that context is missing is that we don't have a precise definition of mass shootings. One thing that's really interesting is if you look at the variety of organizations who do research on the topic, whether it is Everytown for Gun Safety, whether it is the CDC through their school-associated violence death survey, whatever the case may be, is there's no agreed upon definition. The FBI started with 4 people killed when you look at shootings like the 1998 school shooting at Thurston High School up in Springfield, Oregon. 2 people were killed. 25 others were wounded. It's kind of hard to make that argument that that's not a mass shooting, but if you have that hard line at a 4 fatality requirement, then it wouldn't count. So there's been a lot of back and forth, but ultimately what we don't have is a precise definition. With that comes the lack of a national data set on these events. And so it's really hard to offer context if we don't have either a definition or a data set. Now, one of the things is when we look at organizations like Everytown for Gun Safety, and this isn't to pick on them per se, but we've all heard, how many of you, well, let me rephrase this. How many of you guys have heard that there was like the 28th or 82nd school shooting this week? Okay. One thing I would always caution people when they're watching this information is think about the underlying information or goals that you have in telling these numbers, right? I'm sure that we will all agree in this room that guns going off on school campuses disrupts the learning environment, right? Kids go to school to learn, not to dodge bullets. And so, but there are qualitatively different responses to events like Parkland or to Santa Fe versus a gang shooting that happens to take place at a school, like a drive-by, a suicide, or an accidental discharge. And so to lump all of those numbers together is extremely problematic. It leads to these inflated statistics. So because of that, we see that there's these perceptions of trends, and I'd like to offer a little bit of clarity on that. Now, one thing that I did in my first book, unfortunately, I found out on Tuesday night really late that I was coming here, so I didn't have a chance to order any copies, but I did put flyers with a generous 20% discount on your tables if anybody is interested. We spent an entire chapter and an arduous amount of time really looking into the positives and negatives of all of the existing definitions. There are things that some of these organizations, regardless of where on the political spectrum they lean, do really, really well in terms of trying to understand the context. And then there's some that just do horrible. For instance, and no offense to the CDC, but one of the things, if you look at the way their definition is crafted for just a school shooting, if a person commits suicide at a bus stop that happens to be transporting them to school, that's a school shooting. Again, very different than your Parklands, your Columbines, your Sandy Hooks. So we created our own definition and amassed a data source accordingly to be able to kind of try and understand this overarching phenomenon. And a couple of things that we found is that people commonly believe that these things exclusively happen here in the United States. And as John Lott pointed out earlier, they do not. The frequency level obviously is considerably different. One of the more difficult things in trying to capture these events is not only the lack of media attention, but the fact that we call them different things in different countries. So in Africa, they're typically called genocide. If we're talking about Europe, then we're looking at terrorism. So the lack of common terminology also makes it really difficult, but they don't only happen here in the United States. There's also the belief that Columbine was the first school shooting. Columbine was the first time we watched it unfold live, and it's this watershed moment for our country, even here almost 20 years later. But we were able to trace public mass shootings back to the late 1800s. Not all shooters are white males. If we break it out to the male part first, about 4% of mass shooters are female. Not a very large number. It does seem to be a more male-driven problem, but only about 50% of shooters are white, and that becomes very confusing because a lot of people typically think about this as teenage white suburban boys who are committing these acts. And kind of having that narrow scope of what constitutes a mass shooter or a school shooter leads to issues of overprediction where we're profiling people that might not engage in these acts or missing out on warning signs of people that would because we're looking for the wrong things. Also, interestingly enough, handguns, are 3 times more likely to be used than rifles, which is also of a particularly notable thing because we typically hear in the aftermath of one of these events, let's ban all AR-15s, forgetting the fact that AR actually stands for Armor Light Rifle and not Assault Rifle. Workplace shootings and school shootings are among the most common. And part of this honestly just has to do with everyday routine activities. When we think about the individuals who commit these acts, they're looking for people they have easy access to, coworkers, fellow students. It's all about just knowing the ebbs and flow of people's daily activities, and it's extremely easy then for target selection. You don't really have to, stalk your victims or anything like that. You kind of already know where they're going to be. On average, less than 20 events occur annually. Some years there are more, some years there are less. There are not 872 every single year. There ultimately are consequences for how we understand the problem of mass shootings here in the United States. One of the first is a fear of crime, and it can be extrapolated even further than just being fearful of a mass shooting happening. Interestingly, this wasn't planned, with regards to risk perception, you guys may have heard one of the students out of Santa Fe on Friday that they initially shoved a microphone in front of said, I wasn't really surprised when it happened at my school. I was scared, but it was only a matter of time before it happened here. And ultimately, this is, sort of the antithesis of the reality that we see outside of the school environment, which is that people overestimate their perceptions of being falling victim to a mass shooting. The statistical likelihood is extremely, extremely small. It's less than 0.00004 per 100,000. But the amount of media coverage that is generated in the aftermath of one of these events makes these appear extremely commonplace. Again, going back to that mountain versus molehill chart I showed you at the beginning. From there's a demand for change. I already discussed the bringing up of banning assault rifles or AR-15s under the guise that AR stands for assault rifle, despite the handguns are 3 times more likely to be used. But we see a lot of demands for change that don't get satisfied. For instance, the gun show loophole. People have been extremely concerned about the gun show loophole since 1999. Nothing has changed in almost 20 years. So we see this cry for help and this cry for action, but because there's this demand, and then it just kind of goes off everybody's radar and nothing really actually changes. But what I would like to focus most on today is the potential for copycat or contagion effect. And when we talk about copycat, it's the idea that if these individuals see the coverage and the amount of attention that a particular shooter receives, then they are, if they're also seeking that same level of attention, more likely to go out and engage in a similar activity because of the fact that they want to be famous. This was talked about a little bit earlier, and I think an excellent point was made that if somebody wants to commit suicide, they're going to, but it's a very different person who's going to take a number of people out with them before they do that. There has been research, and it's very early in its infancy stages, with regards to copycat or contagion. One of the earliest studies suggested about a 12-day window, within that first 12 days after a shooting is when you're most likely to see the copycats, which I'll come back to in a moment. Other studies have suggested a 2-week window, and some researchers have suggested not necessarily a short-term effect, but definitely a long-term effect, which I will talk about here in a moment. So many of us, I'm sure all of us in the room, know what happened on February 14th in Parkland, Florida. But what you may not be aware of is in the aftermath of the shooting, there was a considerable amount of attention. In fact, one study found that in just 2 weeks after the shooting, over 7,900 stories just online were published about this particular case. So that's not counting what we saw on CBS, CNN, NBC, Fox, you name it, sort of thing. Other shootings that we've seen that have been more lethal or more high profile, interestingly enough, haven't received a considerable amount of attention. Does anybody want to take a guess at about how long the coverage of Las Vegas lasted before everyone moved on? 2 weeks, and everybody had moved on and forgotten about it. The Pulse shooting, 1 week. So we've become, in essence, desensitized to these events where we just immediately move right along the coverage. But there are consequences to the coverage of the Parkland shooting. The first is that the shooter's brother decided that he wanted to start a fan club to capitalize on the amount of attention his brother, the shooter, was receiving. He viewed it as a way that he could get girls, pardon my candidness here, to sleep with him. because he would be able to kind of ride the coattails of the fame that his brother was getting. Then, within about a 1-month period, girls all across the country, and not only girls, but they're the ones that sort of stand out, teenage girls, very much the way my generation, like, oohed and awed over the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, I know I'm dating myself a little bit here, started to send out love letters, money, suggestive photos, all sorts of things that ended up at the shooter's attorney's office. People are sending him sympathy cards, all of this, but a excellent point that was raised earlier is while everybody is sitting here commiserating for the poor orphan shooter who did something because he wasn't loved enough, they're forgetting the 17 people he killed and the 17 that he wounded and the community that he changed forever. The other interesting caveat to the amount of coverage that the Parkland shooter received is school threats. There's an organization called the Educator School Safety Network that tracks averted rampages and similar threats to that mirror the Parkland or other school shootings. And interestingly, from the beginning of the school year until the time that the Parkland shooting happened, they found about 1,408 threats. So over a pretty consistent 180 days, there had been 1,408 threats. But what they found is in the 1 month after the Parkland shooting, threats rose 300% to where there was 1,447 in 30 days. The majority of those, interestingly enough, 1,265 of those threats came within the first 12 days, that contagion period. So this is also of concern, and again, not planned, but we saw with the shooter on Friday, he told law enforcement he specifically spared people because he wanted his story to turn around and get told. And not surprisingly, up until the wedding happened, we were talking about it. Sorry, I'm a little bit bitter about social media. All of this is not really a new surprise. If we look back over the last 19 years, the amount of attention that the Columbine shooters have received is extraordinary. In many cases, we still talk about Columbine today as if it just happened yesterday. I've heard shootings referred to Columbine in a movie theater, Columbine in a mall, Columbine in an airport, Columbine in a church. It always comes back to Columbine. We have shooters today who were not even born or who are extremely young when Columbine happened that are referencing those two perpetrators whose names I will not share. Ultimately, if you actually go on social media, they have their own cult following called the Columbiners. And last summer, I actually took this picture. Last summer, I had the opportunity to go to Columbine for a 4-day symposium. And the very first thing we were told was, let us know if you see anybody out of place, because we have teenage girls showing up at the school who are asking to see where their husbands died because they're saying that they're married to the shooters. So the amount of attention that these individuals receive is inordinate. All of it comes back down to the media portrayal. Ultimately, what we are doing is when people are going out and committing these acts in a way that craves media attention, by giving them that media attention, we are giving them exactly what they want, and we are rewarding their behavior. I am fortunate enough, as I mentioned at the onset, to work for a campaign called No Notoriety. Again, it was started by Tom and Karen Teves after their son Alex was killed in the Aurora shooting. And I'd like to just tell you guys a little bit about this campaign before I go a little bit further. What it calls for is a limiting use of the perpetrator's names and pictures, and you might see that there's an asterisk there. If it is an active scene, as it was with Parkland when the shooter dropped his gun and walked out of the school with everybody else, ultimately, it is extremely important to share that information, right? We want the person to be captured. We want them to be brought into custody so that we know that that threat is secured. But after that point, once that scene is secured and that person is either dead or in police custody, there's no need to keep repeating their name excessively and grotesquely or showing their photo as well. We also should see a refusal to publish manifestos, right? It's just breeding hate. We saw this even with the limited amount of coverage that was given to the Virginia Tech Shooters Manifesto 11 years ago. It also calls for a promotion of data and analysis from relevant experts. Interestingly enough, one thing I learned since Parkland is everybody's an expert, so the word relevant becomes all the more important. And also the need to focus more on the victims, survivors, and heroes. Those are the stories that we should be sharing because it shows the loss and it shows the need to make a change and not accept these events as commonplace or a common thread in our American society. Ultimately, if we deny these individuals fame and notoriety, we should be able to see a reduction in copycats. So the question is, if we know this, why are the media reluctant to adopt this policy? Ultimately, one of the things that we have to take into consideration at the end of the day, and it's something I struggle with all the time, is the media is a business, right? And ultimately, us as news consumers are their source of bread and butter. We tune in, they get advertising dollars, everybody's happy, right? Our need for information is satiated, they get lots of money. So we conducted some research where we wanted to see if news consumers would buy into the No Notoriety campaign. And so just to kind of give you some brief statistics, because they said you guys like hard data. We asked if people believe that the media coverage can contribute to the fame of the shooter. 8 out of every 10 respondents, this was a national sample, said absolutely we believe this. We also asked if they believed that extensive coverage of mass shooters could lead to copycats. About 7.5 out of every 10 said absolutely we agree to this. So then we asked if they would watch or read the coverage if the shooter's name wasn't given. Almost 7 out of every 10 news consumers said, absolutely, we would still follow this coverage. And we also asked what if the picture was withheld? Again, about 7 out of 10 said, absolutely, we would still follow this coverage. So now we know that if the media adopt a no notoriety policy, they're not going to lose their bread and butter in terms of news consumers. So interestingly enough, the World Health Organization has also done some research on this in the context of suicide. And one of the big things that we have to consider when we're looking at the media coverage of these events is not only that we are rewarding the perpetrator for their bad behavior, but we're enticing the next shooter to want to do the same thing to get the same reward. So in the context of suicide, the World Health Organization, when they saw this idea of imitative suicide, says that we should avoid sensationalizing or normalizing language, that we should avoid using the term suicide or referencing any type of methodologies in the headlines, that we should avoid prominent placement. So if we're talking about a newspaper, that would be front page above the fold. If we're talking about television, it's within that before the first break. We should limit the unnecessary and excessive repetition of those stories and exhibit caution in sharing photos or videos. I'm sure we all know who this is. Interestingly enough, in the first 4 months after Robin Williams committed suicide, and this was obviously a very celebrated suicide and something that we saw quite a lot of coverage about, suicide in America rose 10%. Think about how many, again, this all is tying back into this contagion or this copycat effect. And so I caution with the amount of coverage, if we know that there is an overlap between the World Health Organization's principles and the media have been very quick to adopt those, with the exception of these very highly celebrated cases. More recently, it was Chester Bennington with Lincoln Park. When he committed suicide, there was a lot of coverage with that. But ultimately, we know that there's a lot of similarities between how suicide is covered and how mass shootings have been covered. And if the World Health Organization, in association with the suicide prevention teams and organizations throughout the country, have adopted these policies and have been successful in limiting imitative suicide, then why is it that the media won't do the same for mass shootings? Because so many lives are depending on it. So this is why I want to just end by saying no names, no photos, ultimately no notoriety, and that is how we can prevent imitative mass shootings. So that's my contact information, and I'll open it up to questions.
Do you believe that certain interests want to sensationalize these things to make a point, prevent control?
I think both sides are capitalizing. If I'm going to be, I tend to be a very middle of the road person. I think both sides use the media coverage to promote their own specific agendas. But here's the thing: the whole idea of no notoriety is literally just not saying their names and showing their pictures. You can report on everything else: the facts, the who, what, where, when, and why. You can talk about the perpetrator's background. Is Kenneth in here? Oh, he's back there. But One of the one of the later speakers, oh, sorry, Kenneth, you're over there. He did a really great job, which I thought was amazing, on Twitter, where he said, I'm not going to name the Parkland shooter. This is his his jail ID, and this is the only way I'm going to respond to him. You can still talk about the facts of the case without having to name that particular person. So I think if you can still promote your respective agendas, but you don't have to capitalize on showing that person's face over and over and over again to do it.
Since there seems to be an agenda specifically on guns, do you have stats on how many kids are murdered with knives and other weapons, fists and rocks, and also things like the words? Why do we use the words shooters and killers versus murderers and monsters? We really seem to want to sugarcoat who these people are.
One thing that I point out is, I agree with your point about sugarcoating, but I also don't think that using sensationalizing language like monsters is the way to go either. I think that, trying to have a very black and white factual conversation about these events without, imparting the emotion that's already extremely raw is important. When we talk about individuals, just like all of us, these shooters have a first name and a last name, 2 words. The perpetrator, it's the exact same thing we would call anybody that enters the criminal justice system. What we don't want to do is encourage them to seek out fame or notoriety, whether that's through word choices or whether it's through how many stories can be written on them. To answer your first question, I do not have those statistics. I really focus more on the mass shootings and school shootings realm, so I don't want to just give you a bunch of information that wouldn't be correct. But one point to make, that's really, I think, kind of speaks to that is we do not talk about enough the cases where these shootings are averted. Right? And one of the main things, we hear about bad news. It always travels faster here in this country. But again, 1,447, while it's copycat threats, we're not talking about the fact that they were averted before they became Santa Fe or Parkland. So we need to also focus on promoting what can be done to prevent these events rather than how do we react to them once they happen. You guys are an easy crowd. I only got 2 questions. Oh, just kidding. That's an interesting question. I've actually gotten asked a lot about that. To my knowledge, there have not been any in public schools, and if there has, it's been private schools. Sorry, Freudian slip. Private schools, these tend to be in areas that are more public, that have easier restriction or easier access. But one thing, as I said, with one of the trends is when we talk about school and workplace shootings being among the most common, it's places that people already have access to. So if we look at with Santa Fe, with Governor Abbott in Texas saying, well, there was a lot of doors, it wouldn't have mattered if they had 1 door or 27 doors in that school. He was a student. He had access to it. So we have to be looking again at not necessarily being reactive to these events, but proactive, because in 100% of cases, there is an element of leakage and there are warning signs. So we need to improve our threat assessment and we need to improve our proactivity versus our reactivity.
Yeah, the Parkland shooting was linked to this Promise program from the Obama administration. I'm wondering if there's been any research to find out if there are other Promise-type programs in other counties and in other school districts that could be incubators of another event like this.
That I'm not sure of, so I couldn't comment without looking further into it, but I'd be happy to if I could get your email address and send you some information. Nope, that's good. Thank you, guys.